Welcome to Indus Special. I'm Ejaz Haider. Despite the signing of a peace deal between the US and Taliban, Afghanistan's troubles are far from over. Immediately after the four-point deal, President Ashraf Ghani, in a presser the next day, rejected a central tenet related to prisoner swap. He said that the US had no authority to speak on the matter. It was his remit. While he has since walked back that statement partially, announcing a two-phase release of Taliban prisoners, the Taliban have rejected it. Ghani's condition is that the second phase of prisoner release is contingent upon the start of the intra-Afghan dialogue and clear reduction in violence. The Taliban insists that the release of 5,000 of their prisoners is the agreed-upon condition for moving to the intra-Afghan talks and a comprehensive ceasefire. That issue continues to hang fire. But while Ghani is acting as the elected Afghan president, his rival Abdullah is not impressed. Result, two presidential inaugural ceremonies on the same day in venues just a few kilometers apart. Ghani's was more impressive with the international representatives present, but that doesn't reduce the Abdullah factor. The US is trying to intercede and facilitate a compromise. So far, it hasn't been successful. This creates a further problem apropos of talks with the Taliban. Meanwhile, the Turkish ambassador to Kabul, in a statement, has offered Turkey's mediation in intra-Afghan talks if Ankara were invited to do so. In the midst of Afghanistan's known woes, we now have reports of increasing numbers of COVID-19 cases for which the war-ravaged country is barely prepared. Today's program focuses on the situation in Afghanistan. To get to the discussion, let me introduce our first panel of experts. We are joined by Hassan Akbar, who is a former director of Jinnah Institute and is a policy analyst based in Islamabad. We also have with us Dr. Jonathan Schroden, who is director, CNA Center for Stability and Development. Thank you to both panelists. Let me begin with Dr. Schroden here. Dr. Schroden, let's begin with this whole idea of, Ghani partially walking back the initial statement, which was quite categorical. So to that extent, it's a positive development. But what he's trying to do is something that the Taliban have rejected. How do you look at it?
Well, I think Ghani's trying to thread the needle, if you will. I mean, you're right. His initial reaction to the text of the deal that was signed between the U.S. and the Taliban, which said that the U.S. would help facilitate the release of up to 5,000 Taliban prisoners, was to reject it out of hand. But with the sort of political morass that Afghanistan is in right now, I think he really wants the United States to recognize his government and recognize him as the legitimately elected president of Afghanistan. And so he walked back that statement and issued a decree a couple of days ago, as you said, outlining a two-phase prisoner release deal. Now, the Taliban have rejected that as being not in keeping with the spirit of the deal, saying that, the deal says 5,000 and they demand 5,000 before they're willing to move forward. Now, of course, the deal doesn't say exactly 5,000. It says up to 5,000. And so Ghani's decree, his offer of this two-phase prisoner release, meets the letter of the deal, while also trying to throw a bone to the U.S. in order to try and get them to recognize his government. So it's clear he's trying to thread the needle between the United States and the Taliban. Whether he can successfully do that remains to be seen, and certainly doesn't look good so far.
Okay. Let me just put this record. This is Sohail Shaheen, and I am directly quoting from what he told Al Jazeera on Wednesday. He said, "We reject Ghani's phased release of prisoners. We will also make sure at the time of the prisoners' release that they are releasing the list of prisoners we have provided them with. Once this is done, we will proceed with the intra-Afghan talks." Let me pull in Hassan Akbar here. Hassan, it seems to me, and I agree with Dr. Schroden, that obviously Ghani needs the backing of the United States for legitimacy for his presidency, because obviously, as I said in my opening also, there's a problem with Abdullah, and that factor cannot really be ignored. But it also seems to me that he is, if he were to actually release up to 5,000 prisoners, he would be basically relinquishing or surrendering, shall I say, the most powerful tool of leverage that he has at his disposal right now. So his bargaining position obviously was weak to begin with, and if he were to just simply go along, it will only get weaker. Would you agree with that reading of the situation?
I think, yes, Ejaz, you're quite right that there are two elements to what Ashraf Ghani is trying to do at this moment. The first element has to do with legitimacy, so gaining legitimacy for his government and for his presidential election, which is why Ashraf Ghani, let's not forget, initially set the date for the inauguration 2 days before the deal was supposed to be signed on the 29th of February. But there was pressure from the Americans and other countries in the region, and Ashraf Ghani eventually had to delay the inauguration ceremony after the 29th of February and after the deal was signed. So he was trying to gain legitimacy to also improve his bargaining position. Now, as far as the release of prisoners is concerned, it's a contentious issue. As you rightly pointed out, the Taliban have not only said that they're seeking to see the full list of 5,000 people released, but that they would verify the names and the details of all those released into their custody with the list that they already have, and only subsequent to that will they move forward with the intra-Afghan dialogue. So I think Ashraf Ghani is trying both, to manage the release of prisoners. There's also another interesting aspect to this, which is that Ashraf Ghani's decree says that each fighter who will be released will sign an affidavit, yes, so to say, that they will not rejoin the fighting after they're released. Not that it holds any power, but I think it shows that Ashraf Ghani is trying to create an atmosphere, trying to create a presidential atmosphere around his government. He's trying to gain legitimacy and also keep some of the prisoners in his hands to ensure that they have a stronger bargaining position in the upcoming intra-Afghan dialogue. I think what's also startled the Ashraf Ghani government is that the text of the joint declaration between the Kabul government and the Americans, which happened simultaneous to the signing of the Taliban and US deal, in that particular text, the Americans call on the government of Afghanistan to work towards an inclusive Islamic government after the intra-Afghan dialogue. So I think the fear for Ashraf Ghani may also be that his presidency may be short-lived, and that the Americans and other negotiators who will be working towards trying to secure a deal after the intra-Afghan dialogue may foresee a government without Ashraf Ghani as its head, given the various power centers in Afghanistan. So in order to ensure that his position continues, that he is politically relevant in Afghanistan, I think that he's trying to hold the levers and try and create some incentives for himself in the upcoming intra-Afghan dialogue process. But as I've always said, the Americans have agreed to a particular deal with the Taliban. The Taliban are sticking to their position that they are seeking the release of 5,000 prisoners. And I think that the Taliban will push the Americans to ensure that as many prisoners can be released as is possible. I don't think 1,500, the figure for 1,500, which has been announced by the Ashraf Ghani government, is going to hold much water. We still have to wait and see. But I do believe that the Taliban will continue to push for more prisoners to be released prior to the start of the intra-Afghan dialogue process.
Right, Hassan, I think that is a pretty good summary and analysis of the situation. I'm also joined by Mariam Wardak, who's South Asia diary anchor and former advisor to Office of the National Security Council, joins me from New York. Mariam, thank you for being with us. I will come to you shortly, but let me go back to Dr. Schroden here. Dr. Schroden, two things. One, as I said in my opening, that the U.S. is trying to intercede and trying to, figure out some kind of facilitation process. and the Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is also already on record as opposing, the action of parallel governments in Afghanistan. So give me a sense of what your information is in terms of what kind of pressure the U.S. is going to bring to bear on, in this case, Abdullah. Will it be a repeat of the former unity government that we saw? The other thing, of course, is the legitimacy to this deal given by the United Nations Security Council resolution. So that, do you think, also brings the Kabul government under pressure in terms of its earlier objections to the U.S. talking to the Taliban?
Well, I think I'll tackle the second question first. I think the UN Security Council resolution, which was one of the parts that the U.S. agreed to in the U.S.-Taliban deal to secure that resolution, was a pretty big deal. Puts a lot of pressure, as you say, on the Afghanistan government to do what it needs to do in order to get to a phase of intra-Afghan negotiations. I mean, that resolution makes quite clear the international community's desire for this to move into a phase of Afghans sitting down and talking with each other to resolve their differences and try and get to some sort of lasting peace deal. So yes, I do think that creates a bit of additional pressure on Ashraf Ghani to do some of the things that are necessary in order to get to the next phase. In terms of U.S. pressure and what we might be doing with respect to Abdullah, it's harder this time, right? I mean, Abdullah is now in his third presidential election in which he feels that he has been fraudulently cut out of, the power center in Kabul. He agreed in the last election, as you know, to the National Unity Government, in which he played the role of a chief executive officer. But that office was never endowed with very much in the way of power. And he was pretty much sidelined effectively for the last 5 years by Ashraf Ghani. So it's pretty unlikely, in my view, that he would agree to a return to some similar form of national unity government. And he has made quite clear that, this is the third time he believes he's been burned, and he's not going to back down as he did, the first time and to a lesser extent the second time. So there's real pressure, I think, to generate some form of power-sharing government between the Abdullah camp and the Ghani camp that gives more power to Ghani in whatever position, to Abdullah in whatever position it is that he ends up holding. There's also a current of thought that has been going on for some time. People have been calling in the past for some form of interim government, and more recently they've been calling for some form of leadership council that might replace the elected government of Afghanistan in the short term and oversee the process of creating a more inclusive power-sharing government that might include the Taliban, and ideally would as part of a peace agreement. But in order to do that, you would obviously have to revisit a lot of the language in the Afghan constitution as it pertains to the office of the presidency, the powers that it has relative to the other parts of government. And that's obviously a very difficult and serious thing to undertake.
There seems to be likely scenarios here. One is, and I agree with you, that Abdullah is not going to back down, and he's certainly not going to go into the previous kind of national unity government. But there's might be a possibility to get him to agree if Ghani can also be made to agree to that, for both of them, for one to be the president for the first half of the presidential term and for the next to be in line to be the president the second half of the term. And the other scenario that you talked about is, of course, something that Ghani and Abdullah's opposition, as well as the Taliban, would very much like. We shall discuss that further, but let me go to Mariam here. Mariam, thank you for being on the program. Leaving everything aside, let me begin with a very significant letter that, incidentally, your mother wrote to the Afghan Taliban a while ago. And she also thanked Haqqani, as in Siraj Haqqani, for his op-ed in the New York Times. And then she went on to talk about the historic and Quranic role of women in Islam. which I thought was very interesting and also very significant. And she also called upon, in no small measure, to the fact that the manner in which the women were treated under the Taliban is something that brings shame to Islam itself. Give me a sense of why she wrote that letter, and why do you think it is significant in terms of reaching out to the Taliban?
Well, I think that there is a lot of background noise in Afghanistan, especially regards to civil society raising concerns that if the Taliban come back, they are going to take our rights away. And then I think one of the major concerns that my mother, Zakia Wardak, had was that a lot of these women who are making noise are women, civil societies that are benefiting from war economies and projects. But a lot of the average Afghan women citizens don't understand what their rights are. And if they did understand their rights, maybe then they would have utilized those opportunities better. Secondly, one of her objectives was that if the Afghan Taliban are going to be using Islam as their main subject for violence in Afghanistan, then they need to be confronted with the fact that they're giving Islam a bad name. And this kind of PR is not acceptable for any Muslim, for instance. My mom has always had to advocate for Islam being one of the most positive religions, but the fact that the Taliban have mistreated women, that's one of the main arguments that she seems that she had to continue to take place. And also to mention the fact that women are supposed to be the most respected in our religion, and the fact that in Afghanistan patriarchy is starting to go down due to all of the men in the family dying, women are now leading the homes in Afghanistan, and this needs to be known to all of the people in Afghanistan, not only the Afghan Taliban. We also need to really reflect on the fact that men manipulate religion in Afghanistan, in the sense that when they want to disempower the women in their household, not all men, but there are.
I'm happy that you make this point, Mariam, because of course we know what the Taliban did to women when they were in power. But unfortunately, the track record, even when the international community was in Kabul, of the Afghan government's post-U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, have not really been remarkable in terms of how women have been treated. Even though there are lots of women who are now in the workforce, they're working, in offices, doing other jobs, and the rest of it. But there have been scandals. There was a woman who was burnt alive in Kabul. Women have been shot dead. And all of this has happened not under the Taliban, but under the supposedly more enlightened, internationally backed government in Kabul.
Yes, it's an unfortunate situation. We have to really bring attention to the fact that there has been a lot of superficial strides for women in Afghanistan, but there has been not real concrete development. When you go out to the provinces, I am extremely grateful to the fact that the international community has brought education opportunities and better health care for the women in Afghanistan. But if you look at the quality versus Kabul in the provinces, the quality, there's a drastic change in quality. When a girl graduates from high school in the provinces, when she has to go to university, she has to take an additional 2 years because the quality is so behind in the provinces. So again, there has been stride, but there have been very little strides. Even if you look at the women that are in government right now, many of them are there just symbolically. There are very few that have executive power. There are very few that are making decisions. When we look at the Office of the National Security Council, we had a woman there as a deputy just for 1 year, and then she had been shifted off. Or if you look at the National Security Council itself, it's all consistent of men. I think that women should be there based on merit. And this is something that the Taliban have continued to emphasize, that there will be a change. They're going to give women advancement in education and job opportunities. And many of this has to be, the job opportunity has to be based on merit. This is wonderful. This is something that we have to, This is what we need to focus on.
Okay, great. Let me go back to Dr. Schroden before I wrap up this segment. Dr. Schroden, a word about what we just discussed in terms of women empowerment. This is one of the issues, and of course, as it should be, which concerns all sane people who believe in secular, inclusive, and non-gender-based sort of participation in education and other fields of life. This is an issue. Do you really think that, because there was a time when the U.S. and U.S. partners were very concerned about this, that this particular U.S.-Taliban deal actually sort of addresses this? Or do you think that it hasn't been touched, for reasons that are probably obvious, in the sense that, President Trump was in a hurry to get some kind of deal on the table so that there was a drawdown of the U.S. troops?
Yeah, well, I think, the U.S.-Taliban deal does not address rights of women. It also doesn't address rights of minorities. And a broader criticism of the deal is that it doesn't really address the intra-Afghan negotiations and how they should be structured and progress in them. Really, the only thing it says is that those talks were to have started on March 10th, which they obviously have not. Beyond that, it doesn't really say very much about what those negotiations should entail. It's hard to know, not having been party to those talks, it's hard to know whether that was a concession to the Taliban or whether that was deliberate in order to provide additional diplomatic space for the construction of those talks and for Afghans to sort out what those talks should look like among themselves, which is really what should happen. To your point about women, though, what I would say is, right, the U.S. has sort of steadfastly maintained a drumbeat of emphasis on women's rights and minorities' rights and human rights in general in Afghanistan as sort of part of the United States values as a country. But what I think is important to recognize is that it will be essential that women are represented in the intra-Afghan negotiations in order for a comprehensive deal to be brought about and for that deal to stick. There's plenty of academic literature that shows that the inclusion of women in peace processes greatly increases the chances of those processes being successful. And so I think as part of the intra-Afghan negotiations, it'll be incumbent upon the U.S. to insist upon those talks being inclusive and not just inclusive of women, but inclusive of all of Afghanistan's minorities and representative entities like civil society groups and those types of things, because it's in the United States' interests for that to happen, because, again, it will greatly increase the likelihood of a peace deal, if we get to that, lasting over time, which is in the U.S. national interest as well as the national interest of Afghanistan and its people.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. That was Dr. Hassan Schroden speaking with us. We shall retain Mariam Wardak and Hassan Akbar on the panel and take a short break and return to continue our discussion of the situation in Afghanistan. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. We continue with our discussion of the situation in Afghanistan with reference to the hurdles in way of the intra-Afghan dialogue, the political divisions in Kabul, which now has two presidents, continuing violence, and the COVID-19 cases in that country that also pose a major threat to Balochistan and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa here. We are joined by Rahimullah, who is the resident editor of the news and joins us from Peshawar. We still have with us Mariam Wardak and Hassan Akbar. Before I go to Rahimullah Sahab, let me go back to Mariam on one of the questions that we did not ask her in the first segment. Mariam, we talked about your mother's letter and, of course, the position of women in this entire process. But how do you look at the political divisions in terms of, as I said, two presidents, two inaugural ceremonies, just a few kilometers, apart? Do you think there's a likelihood of some kind of power sharing, or there's a likelihood of some kind of interim arrangement? What kind of scenario do you think is likely based on information coming from the ground?
I would like to reflect on what the people are feeling about this. My organization, Her Afghanistan, has over 4,500 members, women. And these women are in a constant state of fear and anxiety at the moment. It's already difficult for governments to deliver their services, and now it's going to be even more difficult for the middle class to the lower class to access any services. They don't understand which institutions are going to be operating and which sector they're going to have to attend to. Are they going to go to Abdullah's people? Are they going to go to President Ghani's people? This state of confusion, because they're also afraid of the personal backlash, because if one team sees them attending to the other team, this might hurt their access to any types of benefits in the future. So the anxiety is reaching to its highest peak. And not only to mention the fact that this is also stalling the intra-Afghan negotiations that need to be taking place because no team has been formed. So whether this is going to be a power sharing agreement, whether this is going to be an interim government, whatever it's going to be, the international community needs to place effort on the fact that this needs to come to an end, because we are a country that is still at war. There are people dying on a daily basis, and there is nothing being done to expedite this process. I mean, if these two nation leaders really care for the best interests of their countries, they need to put their egos to the side, and they need to come and work together. With all due respect to President Ghani, he won with a very razor-thin blade. With only 1 million people who have come out to vote, a small portion of them have voted for him. And with respect to Chief Executive Abdullah, they need to come together, and they need to come to the best solution for the country and the people of this country versus their own power.
I get your point, Mariam. Thank you so much. It was Mariam Wardak speaking with us from New York. Rahimullah sir, what do you think of this division? And you know, Abdullah is not prepared to back down. He doesn't want to get into national unity government kind of framework like previously. There's also the issue of the intra-Afghan dialogue. It seems like this situation is likely to get worse.
You know, if these two have been able to work together for 5 years earlier, why can't they work together again? That's the question, you know. And even Ashraf Ghani is not willing to have a national unity government, but I think he is ready to offer some positions in the cabinet to Abdullah. But I think it won't be like before, when Abdullah got 50% share in the cabinet, and he was the chief executive, which was equal to the office of the prime minister. Now I think what I've heard from the Ashraf Ghani camp is that Abdullah got about 39.5% of the vote, nearly 40%. So they said, we can offer him 40% share in the cabinet, and maybe the chairmanship of the Supreme Peace Council. So I believe that that's the way out, because
but Rahimullah
there has been no violence.
But Rahimullah sir, when you ask the question of if they could work together, why can't they work now? Might I remind you, you and I were together when we met Abdullah in December 2017, and we had asked this question from him in terms of whether he will join a Ghani ticket, and he vehemently said that there was absolutely no possibility. And it was very clear that the divisions ran very deep even then between the two.
But Ejaz, the good thing is that there has been no violence. So he has established a parallel government, and he has taken oath as a president of a non-existence, government, because I think the world has recognized Ashraf Ghani as the president, because his election was certified by the Election Commission. But I believe that, they have to, I think, make some compromise. Abdullah has support in the country, and the fact that he claims to represent the Tajiks, and his ally Dostum claims to represent Uzbeks and Muhakkik the Hazaras. So these are three major ethnic groups in Afghanistan. So that, I think, gives him importance. The fact that he has been contesting election for president for the last three terms, and he claims that every time he was deprived of victory by Hamid Karzai in 2009, by Ashraf Ghani in 2014, and now again by Ashraf Ghani, and he and his supporters claim that this is actually a Pashtun dominant country, and the Pashtuns join hands and deprive non-Pashtuns of their share in power. This is actually what is their argument nowadays.
I agree with you. And let me pull in Hassan Akbar here. Hassan, given the situation, you've heard Jonathan Schroden also, Mariam Wardak, now Rahimullah Yousufzai is also talking about this. It seems to me that despite efforts by the United States and its international partners over a period of almost 19 years to somehow, with a constitution, with parliamentary structures and the rest of it, to turn Afghanistan into some kind of state which can work institutionally. But I think the divisions run pretty deep, and there's still the tribal sort of approach to things. In which case, if you agree with me, would you like to share my pessimism about where things are going?
I think you're right, Ejaz, that in Afghanistan, the divisions in politics, in society, run so deep. And they have been a cause for much of the intra-Afghan rivalries. These divisions have also pulled in different neighbors in the region to support different groups within Afghanistan and have fueled the conflict inside the country. The failure of having Afghanistan as a country, I think, is multiple. As I like to say, that there's also not just an ethnic and linguistic division in Afghanistan, but there's also a growing urban and rural division within Afghanistan, where you have a lot of young Afghans who've studied in colleges over the last 2 decades and who want a more progressive Afghanistan, a more democratic Afghanistan. At the same time, you have rural Afghanistan, which is in some ways very much orthodox and conservative in its views and has not changed over the last 40 years. So that's one division. There are challenges of financing Afghanistan as a government. So in the face of all these challenges, I think the hope still remains that the Afghans, after decades of conflict and war, realize that they must come together, they must work together, and they must put aside many of the their own concerns, their personal ambitions for political office, to try and create a framework where Afghanistan can go forward with Ashraf Ghani, with Abdullah, and with the Taliban and other actors in Afghanistan who hold a lot of power in their own regions and who have been erstwhile warlords in Afghanistan. So it's very important to bring all these groups together. Unfortunately, I think President Ghani's election, the announcement of the results, the inauguration, have all sort of been happening simultaneous to an intra-Afghan dialogue process. In my view, I think the idea of an interim government would have been an ideal situation to move forward towards an inclusive government in Afghanistan and a new framework and new structure for government in Afghanistan, because it would have allowed all these various power centers in Afghanistan, some of whom are not even represented in the current government, either through Abdullah or through Ashraf Ghani. So I think it was very important to bring all these people together. The election of and the inauguration of President Ghani has sort of, I think, created a spanner in the works and may create even further complications going forward, because after all, he is in control of the government and official machinery of the Kabul government in Afghanistan. But I do think that eventually all political players, especially those such as Ashraf Ghani, who do not have that kind of tribal power or backing as some of the other opposition members have, will have to give in to the wish of the international community, the regional countries, and many people within Afghanistan to see peace return to Afghanistan. I hope that there is a move forward movement. Pessimism, of course, exists because we've been here before. We've seen Afghanistan come out of a conflict brought about by invasion of the Soviet Union, and the result we all saw that it quickly spiraled into conflict which centered around Kabul. But we're not there, it's not the same time today. There is a lot more international interest. There is commitment from the US for overseeing the intra-Afghan dialogue process and ensuring its success. The Taliban have shown a lot of flexibility also.
Let me come back to the US commitments, Hassan, because that's an important issue. But at this point, since we were talking about the political divisions and the tribal approaches in Afghanistan, we are joined by Ajmal Sohail, who's the co-founder of Afghan Liberal Party, political, national security and intelligence analyst. He joins me from Stuttgart in Germany. Mr. Sohail, thank you so much. Since you co-founded a liberal political party, give us a sense of, whether what you see in Afghanistan in terms of what I would call the cage of traditions and conventions, and whether they're tribal, whether they're ethnic divisions. Is it a frustrating experience?
Thanks a lot for having me, of course. So since a few decades ago, when I got started to establish my Afghan Liberal Party in Afghanistan, so we were faced, to be honest, with a number of the issues that, because of the to be honest, that the military sponsorships of some of the countries that led Afghanistan not to be peaceful and get the Afghan people to be backwarded and not to be in the right direction. However, some of the youngsters, as it's mentioned by some of my colleagues here, that they are of the interest to have a prosperous Afghanistan, to have a progressive Afghanistan. But still, the tribalism, there are some other issues that in Afghanistan still exist because of they are. We were having that from the past because of the military sponsorship of the United States and some of our local governments. I mean the regional countries. They supported the different ethnic groups and different military-minded groups that they in order to reach to their national interest in Afghanistan, and that was a huge challenge in front of me, not only in front of me, but in front of the most of the democratic elements in Afghanistan to fulfill.
And did you succeed?
We are tried, but unfortunately, to be honest, so the way that we wanted the liberal democracy to be fulfilled in Afghanistan, or to be enacted, or to be materialized in Afghanistan, that was a long way ahead, and we tried that way for the last 2 decades, but unfortunately, we were not able to do it because you know that to support democracy is to back up or to support the democratic elements. To be honest, neither the United States nor the regional countries were of the interest to support the liberal democratic system in Afghanistan. Because that's
a very interesting point, Mr. Sohail. I think this is something which we should discuss exclusively on a different program. But thank you so much for your insights and for joining the program. Let me go to Rahimullah Saab. Rahimullah Saab, Hassan talked about the U.S. commitment. Now, here's the thing. Ashraf Ghani initially said that he rejects the prisoner swap. Then he walked back that statement partially, because he's also on record as saying that if the US troops leave, the Afghan National Security Forces will fold in less than 6 months. So he is dependent on the US. So there, and now in terms of the internal political legitimacy also, he needs US and US partners backing. Give me a sense of how much is he going to play along, and at what point he might become a spoiler.
You said that Ashraf Ghani has partially agreed to release Taliban prisoners. I think it's just the beginning, and he will eventually release all 5,000. Already, his people are saying that these prisoners would be released in 2 installments, 1,500 now and 3,500 later. So I think we have to understand that Ashraf Ghani is always boasting. He gives these tough statements, but then he quietly retreats because he does not really have the power to do whatever he says. Now, if he is putting some more conditions regarding the release of prisoners, like they have to give in writing that they won't return to the battlefield, and Taliban then refusing this condition, I think Ashraf Ghani will have to make a compromise. He will have to make a hasty retreat, and that is what the Americans will ensure. So this brings us to his huge dependence on the US. The Americans have given him legitimacy by attending his inauguration, and because of the US, other Western countries have done that as well. Pakistan also has recognized the legitimacy of his, presidency or whatever. So in a way, I think he owes it to America first and foremost, and he will have to listen to the Americans as they go along, because the peace process is an American project, and they want this intra-Afghan dialogue. And I think eventually Ashraf Ghani also knows that he cannot survive without American support. That's why I'm saying that this, if Trump has his way, if he stops funding the Afghan security forces, $5 billion plus, from where
then the jig is up. I have to wrap up. Hassan, very quickly in like a minute or so. 2 things. One about the US funding, and secondly, as I said, this COVID-19 cases in Afghanistan also pose a great threat to Balochistan and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa.
Yeah, I think as far as the funding is concerned, I mean, America is paying the bill for Afghanistan and for Ashraf Ghani. So eventually Ashraf Ghani, I agree with Rahimullah Saab wholeheartedly, will have to come through on US commitments given to the Taliban. I think there's no way out of it. On the COVID cases, there have been some cases in Pakistan also, and round about that number in Afghanistan, more are suspected in Afghanistan. We have a very porous border with Afghanistan, both across Balochistan and across, Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. It's very difficult to control the flow of populations from both countries. It poses a real threat for Pakistan. This entire belt, you see, has also seen some of them, polio, for example, which has been removed across the world. It has survived particularly because of the terrain in this area. Because it's so difficult, people often cross their carriers of viruses, tuberculosis, etc. So I think it's a very difficult situation that Pakistan finds itself in, and I think the coronavirus will also lead to difficulties in arranging the intra-Afghan dialogue, because almost all Afghan dialogue processes, including the intra-Afghan ones that have taken place outside Afghanistan. And in the absence of flights in other countries, stopping people from traveling, where do you find a venue for an intra-Afghan dialogue process? Perhaps is going to be delayed. So there are several complicating factors in this, and we'll have to see how Corona progresses both in Afghanistan, but more importantly within Pakistan, and what steps we can take for better public safety and health safety regulations and testing and screening of patients not just in the urban cities of Pakistan, but also in
the
far-flung rural areas,
and
border areas in Balochistan and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa.
Absolutely. Thank you, Akbar. That was a very important point with reference to how it could impact the intra-Afghan dialogue. Of course, there are many factors already in play which could likely weigh it down, but this is an additional factor. So thank you, Hassan Akbar. Thank you, Rahimullah, Yousufzai. This is all for tonight from Indus Special. We shall see you tomorrow at the same time. Meanwhile, for latest updates, you can follow us on social media at indus.news. Good night and goodbye.